Hello everyone. Magandang umaga, magandang hapon, magandang gabi, buenos dias, buenas tardes. Welcome to another episode of the First World Manila podcast. Remarketing our national culture to ourselves so we're inspired to fix this country. That's my new tagline. Okay. Today's episode is going to be about foreign direct investment. So, some of you, or what it is exactly, and want to talk about the definition of foreign direct investment and how it applies to the Philippines, how it can help, and what the issues are, etc., etc. So that is today's episode. You might see if you read the if you often read the business news in the Philippines, you might see the term come up quite often, foreign direct investment. So here's an example. Like I'm gonna behind me, if you're for those of you not watching on YouTube, if you're listening on podcast, I have some tabs open, and just as some examples of what you might see on the internet as far as business news as it relates to or as it pertains to the Philippines and FDI. So here's one. DTI urges removal of foreign ownership caps, focus on job creation. So it's one example. I mean, this doesn't exactly say FDI, but that's one example. Um, hmm. Here's another one. Protectionist clauses in the Philippine Constitution restrict the flow of foreign direct investment. So yeah, you might see that come up often. Um, PH still lagging behind peers in attracting foreign investments. Here's one from was it 2013? This is from NEDA, National Economic and Development Authority. So we could have attracted investments if only Philippines is more open. So this one also talks about FDI or foreign direct investment as well. So what is FDI or foreign direct investment, and why do a lot of people talk about it in the business and economics scene in the Philippines? I have one link for you that I think is pretty concise, or pretty concise, but also pretty comprehensive as far as what FDI is. And here it is. This is from the Muse, or sorry, not the Muse, different website. The Balance, foreign direct investments, its pros, cons, and importance to you. So I'm just going to read out what it is here and why. And once I read it and I give you the definition, you'll understand why FDI is so important to a country like the Philippines. Okay, so foreign direct investment is when an individual or business owns 10% or more of a foreign company. If an investor owns less than 10%, the International Monetary Fund defines it as part of his or her stock portfolio. So that's a big difference, because if you follow markets here at all, like the stock market, you might have seen like foreign money coming in and buying Philippine stocks, for example. That is not foreign direct investment. That is foreign portfolio investment. So big difference. Um, a 10% ownership interest doesn't give the investor a controlling interest. It does allow influence over the company's management, operations, and policies. For this reason, governments track who invests in their country's businesses. So again, it's a significant amount of foreign investment into a business. One famous example would be a foreign corporation putting up a factory, for example, in a foreign country, in a local country. Excuse me, not local country. A foreign business putting up a domestic factory. That's the best way to put it. That is an example of foreign direct investment. Okay, so I'm reading again from the Balance. Importance of FDI. Foreign direct investment is critical for developing and emerging market countries. Their companies need the multinationals' funding and expertise to expand their international sales. Their countries need private investment in infrastructure, energy, and water to increase jobs and wages. The UN report warned that climate change would hit them hardest. Well, okay, scratch that last sentence. While important, is not relevant to this conversation. But anyways, okay, so what's important here is that there's foreign expertise and funding coming into basically a poorer country. like basically a transfer of capital, both financial capital and human capital, in the sense that foreigners bring their know-how to the country, and ideally it enhances the local workforce. So that's obviously, you can see why this would be such an important issue in a poor country like the Philippines. So here are some pros and cons of FDI. So I won't go through all this, but suffice it to say, some of the pros include fi bringing financing to countries and know-how and technology. Um, some of the negatives, it might be, for example, not suitable for strategically important industries. So you don't, theoretically, you might not want a foreign entity having a controlling stake, for example, in in an industry of national importance, hmm, like for example in South Korea, like Samsung is like um, their big electronics firm, and that's sort of like really what helps them as a country is having these big conglomerates that also do stuff for the country, as opposed to, for example, here in the Philippines. But imagine a imagine sort of a pro-Korean, like a big company that's strategically important to the local economy, that's local population. It really helps out the people and the locals in the country. You might not want, theoretically, you wouldn't want a foreigner to have a controlling stake in that. Um, in fact, you might see that in the news, actually. I mean, as an aside, you'll see between the U.S. and China, for example, sort of mergers and acquisitions being blocked on both sides by the local government against, the foreigner coming in and buying up assets in a strategic industry. So you might see that happening. But I want to focus more on the positives of what FDI can do for this country and why it hasn't materialized in the Philippines, while in other countries, most and in the most contrast, for example, with our neighbors, why it's been helping them and not us, and how that's affecting us as well. Um, okay, let me just go over my notes a sec, see if I should move on to the next. Here we go. Okay, so one important thing I want to bring up about foreign direct investment is what's called, I mean, so there are several pros and cons, but one pro I really want to focus on is known as technology transfer. And the idea here is that theoretically, if a foreigner sees a business opportunity in the Philippines, for example, and they put up a factory here, like an electronics manufacturing company in a plant, for example, uh, and they bring in their foreign know-how, for example, and their managerial processes. The idea is that there's sort of what's called a technology transfer or a spillover effect, where technology is brought into the country that was built elsewhere, and we have our local people work with that technology, and they learn about it, and they get some ideas, for example, and they're inspired to do their own R&D, so that the Philippines creates uh, its own sort of competitive or comparative advantage in technology, for example. And the reason why technology is important is for several reasons. I think the big one is that historically it's been technological advancement that's brought up the wages or average standard of living of many people. You can look at the UK in the 1800s, or even China recently. This technology comes in and it helps, for example, especially in manufacturing. Manufacturing now comes into the country. It brings people out of poverty, because you can pay people more, but still, as a business, you can pay people more, but still make a profit, because newer technology is value add. It's more cost competitive, it adds more value to consumers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's in that sense, theoretically, it's a win-win situation, and we've seen it. And although it's not perfect, I mean, pollution, for example, comes to mind. Um, Climate change, echoing that statement earlier, but it has that's how countries became rich, basically, or have a thriving middle class. That is a backbone, backbone historically to building a stronger middle class with a decent quality of life. So it's super important. And again, and for those of you watching on YouTube, this write up right here is just talking about how there's evidence that's this sort of technology transfer has taken place, or and a spillover effect has taken place, arguably in a country like South Korea, for example. All right. So yeah, technology transfer and spillover effects are good because we want to build our human capital, basically. But excuse me, this is the one. This is actually the paper on Korea. The other one's just an FDI in general. But anyways, the other reason why we want FDI is because of jobs. So this is quoting the Department of Trade and Industry. So this was May 22, 2018. I'm looking at this article again from Business World. And then this is quoting the Trade Secretary Ramon M. Lopez, who was he is quoted saying this. We see the imperative for and agree to the proposed removal of the nationality requirements. So again, those are sort of restrictions to foreign investors investing here. Like for example, you have to have a local partner, or you can only own up to a certain amount of a business here if you're a foreigner. So that's sort of an impediment to FDI here. What is important is that jobs are created here in the Philippines for the Filipino people, regardless of ownership or market to be served. So that's, again, another important thing is, over the near term, is to create more jobs for people here. Over the long term, we want to build human capital and raise the average standard of living. Over the short term, we want jobs. Okay. This other one from Neda again. Who was saying it here? I'm just scrolling down this article. Anyways, you can increase, theoretically, somewhere in this article, someone was saying, I can't find it right now, but you can increase the quality of services as well. You want competition, etc., etc. So that's another important issue. The idea here is that not only do you provide jobs, but with competition and innovation, you have more. That also helps, obviously, increase quality of life theoretically. Although all other things being equal, that would especially work with an antitrust law, by the way. So again, FDI has to work with several things, but FDI is an important issue in the development of the Philippines. Okay. You can see here, and again, I sort of highlighted this before, looking at this graph here. This is still 2013, but it's still relevant today. I think there's another article here that shows that we're still pretty low in FDI. But anyways, this is foreign direct investment in ASEAN, 2004 to 2013. You could see high ones like Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam. We're sort of in the lower end, the Philippines. So, okay. Even then, and then looking at the statement below this graph, the 1987 Constitution is cited as a roadblock to foreign direct investment. And again, largely because we have a clause that stops foreign ownership of property, or doesn't stop it, but it limits it to 40%. So here's this article here: protectionist clauses in the Philippine Constitution restrict the flow of foreign direct investment. It cites specifically the specific clause about property ownership. So if you can imagine, and this is what people have told me, what foreigners have told me, like, why would I invest and put up a factory here in the Philippines if I can't own on the land? It's much more difficult to do business if I don't have control over the property of where my factory, upon which my factory is being built. So that's a disincentive for people to bring in factories and, create jobs, competition, innovation, and the technology transfer and spillover effects that we want. Okay, so it's become a popular issue. Okay, yeah, here's another one. For example, this is earlier this year. Actually no, a few days yesterday, December 8, 2018. PH still lagging behind peers in attracting excuse me, attracting investments. So we're still behind. Okay, this has obviously been a popular issue among sort of the people in the business scene and the economic scene in the Philippines. And I want it to be an important issue, of course, to everybody in the country, considering that most people vote. And when they vote, they also vote for economic policies, which includes foreign direct investment. So part of the Duterte administration's part of their economic agenda is to increase the amount of foreign direct investment in the country. So they've actually allowed 100% ownership in 5 investment areas. So this article came out. This is Rappler. Government allows 100% foreign ownership in 5 investment areas. This was in November 1, 2018. So these areas are internet businesses, teaching at higher education levels, training centers, adjustment companies, lending companies, financing companies, and investment houses. That's sort of one category, or that is one category, excuse me, wellness centers. So that's nice, but missing the golden bullet, or excuse me, the silver bullet, which is property. Okay. This article also mentions that the current administration also wants to specifically do business with China. Obviously, we're all aware of excuse me, the current administration's ties with China. Currently, the Philippines is supportive of China's One Belt, One Road initiative. So that's sort of China's play to increase its influence in the region by offering economic assistance. However, another Rappler article, well, my browser is freezing for some reason, but okay, here we go. I'm gonna move myself again here to the right side. Okay. Looking at Chinese foreign direct investment, there's actually not a lot. Not a lot. So this is the article called "In Charts: Don't Credit China for Philippine Growth Just Yet." So this is November 20, 2018. So we actually don't have, relatively speaking, that much. If you look at this graph here, and for those who are listening on podcast, China's foreign direct investment is below that of the USA, Singapore, the Netherlands in 2017. It's not high. I think Japan is our biggest foreign direct investor. Investor. So yeah, yes, here we go. Here's another example showing where ODA. I guess what's ODA? Oh, sorry, official development assistance. So like Japan, like state, basic government to government. Japan is the biggest one, not China. I think looking at this chart in 2017, Japan was 36.5% of ODA. Again, ODA stands for official development assistance, whereas China was a meager 0.4%. Where China is bringing the money is, as many of you are probably aware, is the offshore gaming sector. Basically, China has outsourced its gambling to the Philippines. My understanding, I have a very superficial understanding of POGO, Philippine Offshore Gaming. That's what it's called, and I want to get into it more in the future episodes. But basically, offshore gambling from China, it's not allowed in the mainland, so they just do it. So basically, it's done here in the Philippines for people in China, and that's brought in a lot of mainland Chinese into Metro Manila. I'm sure many of you are aware, and you go to Makati in South City, and you'll see tons and tons of mainland Chinese, which is, I normally wouldn't have a problem with that, but like when it gets to a point where you're pushing locals out, then it becomes a problem. And see, here's why it's important to specify what kind of FDI we get. It's one thing to have like a foreign company owning land but putting up a factory in it, or an electronics manufacturing facility, for example. It's another thing to have someone come in and just buy real estate just for Philippine offshore gaming. There's sort of, well, you're sort of creating a bubble in urban areas, and or you're increasing the price of housing in urban areas, and it's looking like locals are being pushed out, but the investment isn't super productive. I mean, it gives locals here some jobs, but there's no technology transfer or spillover or R&D or et cetera, which is what a country like the Philippines needs. So there we go. So I want to show. So I want to conclude this episode by talking about how we got to this where we are now, because I mean, if you've been listening to me over the past, I don't know, since the beginning or whatever past number of podcast episodes, you know that I like to talk about more deeper issues that are sort of these deeper issues that are the causes of whatever topic I'm talking about for the episode. And there are deeper issues that are influencing the outcomes of the state of foreign direct investment in the Philippines. And there is a really good article. I mean, everything I'm showing here in my browser, I will put all the links in the description. But this is, if you had to choose one article to read from the list of links I will be posting on the description, it is this. It is from The Diplomat. So this came out in November of this year. This is very comprehensive, and I really like it because it touches upon a lot of what I think the problems are plaguing our country. So this is called "Why is the Philippines the Home of Chinese Offshore Gambling?" Because if you look at our neighbors, there's not really that much offshore gambling for reasons that will be talked about in this article. And I highly suggest you read this. I mean, I'm not going to read all of it to you, of course. I just want to read a few passages. But basically, as it pertains to FDI, if the FDI or lack thereof does play a role in how we've gotten to our present situation, basically, FDI that was supposed to be going to manufacturing never went there historically. Basically, government-owned and controlled corporations that were supposed to have been involved in FDI and manufacturing have just become vehicles of political opportunism. Contrast that to what's happened in our East and Southeast Asian neighbors, where even though there is corruption in their state-led institutions, there's these institutions that do manufacturing or are involved in foreign direct investment still are beholden to some performance benchmarks, whereas in our case, these government-controlled corporations have historically incurred heavy losses. So, I just want to read a few passages. It's a very, very good article. Please read all of it. I could never do as good a job as this writer. Who is this? Mr. Alvin Kamba, PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University and pre-doctoral fellow at the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University. Okay, well, he's the expert, but I could never do anything like this, and I highly suggest you read this. But I will read a few passages because I think it's important as it pertains to FDI, which is what we're talking about today. Okay. Let's see. Well, first let me blow my nose. I'm really sick. There's something going around, and I have it, and lots of work and little sleep. So, okay. So here are the passages I'm going to read. Here is a passage I'm going to read. First, the Philippine government has been unable to attract a substantial amount of FDI in manufacturing and other sectors that target the export market. This ultimately is because of the failure of consecutive Philippine administrations to build a strong manufacturing economy or adequately invest in the natural resource industry in order to be competitive in the export economy. Generations of Philippine politicians and bureaucrats have attempted to institutionalize government-owned and controlled corporations. So again, I mean, my comments here. It's not that people have tried. People have tried. There are good people as growth enhancing and revenue providing measures. Instead, many of these were privatized as assets and sold to private entities. The remaining GOCCs, that's short for government owned and controlled corporations, consistently incur annual losses, leading to government bailouts and misallocated resources. This is your taxpayer money at work. These GOCCs are populated by appointed consultants to pay off debt after every election or control the corporation for political ends. Put simply, employment in these companies simply fulfills political promises made by politicians to their allies or regional elites to their constituents. So I'm going to skip over a part of the passage because this is a comparison to East and Southeast Asia. So again, in our neighbors, even though they've had similar situations where they sort of had their own equivalents of GOCCs, again, their GOCCs were rewarded for successful investments in manufacturing or the natural resource sector. So, and then as the writer points out, the Philippine politicians, even before and during the Marcos administration, simply subsidized and directed state assistance to their private sector allies, despite their failure to compete. So again, inefficiency. An interesting passage here that's not really related to what we're talking about today, but I do want to bring up. The non-crony private sector leaned away from the dominance of the cronies in the manufacturing and technology sectors, investing in malls, real estate, land, and luxury hotels and casinos. It's interesting. Anyways, so I'm going to go back to another part of the of this article. This is talking about how the GOCC's relative weakness is related to FDI and POGO. Conversely, the majority of GOCCs in the Philippines are relatively weak and unproductive, becoming conduits for politicians to fulfill their goals. This explains the absence of Chinese manufacturing FDI in the Philippines. So again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Chinese FDI in the manufacturing sector is pretty much non-existent. Instead, Chinese companies opt to participate in construction contracts funded by Chinese aid due to the Philippine government's more embedded role in that sector. So, just in construction contracts, but not like manufacturing, which again is what we need. Other East and Southeast Asian economies have induced the private sector to invest in manufacturing, innovate, and research. In the early 20th century, the Japanese directed Mitsubishi and Toyota to pursue car production despite heavy financial losses for decades. The South Korean government initially guided their chaebols, that's the South Korean conglomerate basically, to pursue manufacturing investment despite the Korean private sector outgrowing state control to pursue profit-oriented ends. South Korea, Malaysia, and Indonesia had cronies too, yet these private sector allies were rewarded for their relatively successful investments in the manufacturing or natural resource sector. So again, and this is what I mentioned earlier, in contrast, Philippine politicians, even before and during the Marcos administration, simply subsidized and directed state assistance to their private sector allies despite their failure to compete, which resulted in inefficiency and heavy losses for decades. The non-crony private sector, I read that part 2 already. So anyways, I want to just talk about the conclusion of this article. Again, please read all of it. The conclusion of the article. In sum, the structure of the Philippine economy, relying on consumption, exporting labor to acquire remittances, and possessing a strong internal market, and the nature of Philippine elites' capital accumulation make it logical for offshore gambling firms to invest in the country. The Philippines' relative autonomy from the Chinese government also encouraged Macanese capital, so Macanese capital from basically money from Macau, to invest in the Philippines, knowing that their Philippine host state allies can protect them from Beijing's reach. There we go. Macau, by the way, is sort of the gambling hub in China. So if the Chinese mainland government, for example, cracks down on gambling in Macau, then people want to gamble there have to go somewhere else. In this case, the Philippines. So I'm not going to point fingers at anyone in particular, for what's going on today. Even the mainland Chinese. I mean, everyone's trying to make a living with this in the situation that they're given. So what's the saying? Hate the game, not the player. But then again, that you have to change the game. So everyone's to make a living. You, me, other Filipinos, the mainland Chinese. I mean, my family has done business with the mainland Chinese, and we continue to do so. For example, so um, you take advantage of what's available. So it's hard. I mean, a lot of people, for example, are making money, leasing out units to POGO, but you can't blame them. I mean, how else are they going to make money? Um, so it's the rules that have to change. Um, the rules have to change so that everyone benefits in the short term and the long term. So I think right now what we're looking at is the short term. So even though there's basically money coming into real estate, it's again not really going into the long term, which is manufacturing or technology, basically technology transfer and spillover. What's interesting about this article too, this why is the Philippines a home for Chinese offshore gambling, is that the author doesn't just talk about East Asian countries to compare the Philippines to, but he also talks about Malaysia and Indonesia. One would think because I mean the base culture of the Philippines, like Indonesia and Malaysia, is basically Austronesian slash Malay. Um, why are they able to get things off the ground in terms of productive investments into manufacturing and innovation and R&D, and we aren't? If we share the same, assuming we share the same root culture, why do we have a problem? So I'm sure there are lots of theories about that, but um, my take on it, and I've sort of repeated this in other forms in previous podcasts, is that, oops, someone messaged me. My take on it is that the way we develop as a country and as a culture is very different. We were colonized by different people, and our society developed differently. Uh, we're not we're not that separated, for example, by race. I don't think as much as relative to at least to Malaysia and Indonesia, for example. I mean, we have a educated class that is of mixed descent. That might be why we don't feel a strong loyalty to the country, because I wonder if it's easier to feel a stronger sense of national identity if you're ethnically homogenous. So, like in Malaysia, in Indonesia, for example, there's a difference. There's a very stark sort of divide between ethnic Malays and Chinese. I mean that exists here to a certain extent, but not as much as there. I mean, because a lot of Filipinos are of Chinese descent. I mean, I'm of Chinese descent, or of mixed descent and whatever. And of course, in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, China, it's easier to. I wonder if because these are generally racially homogeneous societies, relatively speaking. I wonder if it's easier to rally around a cause if you're racially homogenous and I mean, that sounds very politically incorrect, but I wonder if it's easier to do that. So the challenge for us, I think, is to build this sense of national identity where we all strive for the greater good for the most part, that goes above and beyond race and ethnicity, which I think is very difficult, um, and religion. And social class, everything else. That's very difficult to do. But again, it always goes back. It always goes back to the culture and to identity. Uh, but that's what we want to strive for, and that's the mission of this podcast: remarketing our culture to ourselves, so we feel a stronger sense of national identity. So that even if there is corruption here, there are mitigating factors, and things still get done, and the average standard of living of most people here will at least rise secularly. So that's the best we can hope for, and I hope to develop. I hope we can develop our. I hope we look at our culture and see how amazing it is, and really see for what it is, and embrace who we are, so that we can rally around something regardless of of whatever your individual background is, so that we can get things done, what needs to be done. And one example of that is having a foreign direct investment policy that allows for the long term raising of the standard of living of people here, and that's again related to manufacturing and foreign property ownership, and technology transfer. And this is a very surface level podcast about this issue. I mean, there are a lot of layers to FDI and how it works in theory, in practice versus theory. But I don't want to get into that now because this is just one episode, and we have a lot more episodes to go in the future. But I want to sort of introduce you to this idea, and we can talk about it more in the future. Okay. I would like to end this episode with our usual Tagalog, Spanish, and even English vocab, because I include English here because the word foreign direct investment is very hard to translate into Tagalog. I mean, I don't know, so I'm just gonna just say the direct word for word translation for it. So, investment, pamumuhunan. Wow, that's a mouthful. Foreign, dayuhan, dayo, iba, right? Direct, tuwiran. That's like literally, I'm sure there's a better way of saying that. Any Tagalistas can help me out. You can comment or email or whatever. In Spanish, it's la inversión extranjera directa. It's pretty simple. Foreign direct investment. So thank you all for listening to this week's episode. And if you like the First Manila podcast and you feel moved and motivated by it, one thing you could do to support me is to share this podcast with people. I know a lot of you use Spotify, so I'm not sure the sharing function goes there, but if you can, share it with your friends. Thank you for your support, and I will see you next week. This is Ramon Rodrigo Roberto Calao Cuenca, CFA, signing off. Next week. Mag-ingat kayo. Que tenéis una buena semana. All right.